City Hall sits close to the mighty St. John River. It begins in Quebec and Maine and flows for 673 kilometres or 418 miles until it empties into the Bay of Fundy. Many First Nations peoples have used the river for travel, trade, navigation and sustenance for over 12,000 years. French and British settlers, as well as American colonists, similarly used the river over several hundred years. Today, it is mostly recreational and highly prized by New Brunswickers. Now I quote from a City of Fredericton document, quote, "With the arrival of the Loyalists at St. Anne's Point in 1783, the river became a hub of activity. The river also helped shape the layout of the City of Fredericton. In 1827, an act of the legislature established 11 public landings along Fredericton's shoreline. In order to provide access to the public landings, Fredericton streets were extended to the riverbank." End of quote. In fact, the city owns the bed of the river where it runs between the municipal boundaries. In earlier days, passenger ferries from the north side of Fredericton would dock behind the present City Hall at what was known as Middle Ferry Landing. By 1827, the ferry from Phoenix Square to St. Mary's Ferry Landing ran from sunrise to 10 o'clock at night. It carried people, freight, carriages, wagons, and animals. A steam-powered ferry began work in 1842. Then, when the highway bridge was finished in 1885, the little ferries were no longer needed. City Hall dominates Phoenix Square on the northwest corner of Queen and York Streets. It's called Phoenix because of the mythical phoenix bird that rose again from its ashes into a new life. So too has the square revitalized itself. Many fires since the early 1800s destroyed the early commercial buildings and new ones sprang up in their place. Early City Hall days showed much commercial activity and many public events in the square. Scan through lots of images on the website to see all the activity. The present City Hall building was ready for use by 1876. It had a community market in the basement and the council chamber and offices on the first floor. But its main feature was the Opera House on the second floor. It held about 800 people and was the city's popular entertainment center for over 50 years. Many famous actors and performers from around the world arrived to thrill local audiences. Today, Fredericton City Hall is a registered National Historic Site. The clock in the City Hall Tower is well worth a look. It was built by a well-known company in England and dates from 1878. It struck the bells for the first time in 1879. Then, about 130 years later, the clock was sent away to be expertly restored. After almost a year of restoration, it began ticking again in June of 2009. You can see all its wonderful inner workings inside the City Hall front area and up the stairs by the council chamber. In front of City Hall is the popular fountain with Freddie the nude dude. Since 1885, many visitors have stopped by to say hi to Freddie and admire the fountain. Westward, but almost next to City Hall, is the Randolph Building, built in 1878. It was designed by the prominent Nova Scotian architect James Charles Philip Dumarec. Over the years, it has housed various operations, including the staff and printing presses of the local newspaper. Opposite Phoenix Square, on the northeastern corner of York and facing Queen Street, is a large 3-story brick building with old iron fencing. It was originally part of the military compound for the British Imperial regiments stationed there from 1784 until they withdrew in 1869. The land was bought for the construction of the normal school in 1876. In 1914 an annex was added and it is still standing. But then, in 1929, the main part of the building burned down, leaving just a shell. But the pink granite pillars at the front of the building survived this very dramatic fire. By 1931, a larger and more modern facility was built. In 1947, it became the Teachers' College, and when the college closed, in the late 1960s, it was preserved as a provincial justice building. York Street itself now beckons. So we go southwards 1 block along the western side of York. Many small stores today carry on the tradition of small businesses. For example, those stores in the middle of the block stand on the site of the Commercial Hotel, built in 1850 by George Atherton. The hotel operated until 1913 when the building was sold. A large yard and stabling facilities helped care for 40 horses. Golding's livery stables also hired out horses and carriages. Just before King Street, at the northwest corner of York and King Streets, is the painted brick Gilman Building. The year 1905 appears with the Gilman name high up on the facade facing York Street. George Gilman was a prominent lumberman from the late 1800s, and he ran his businesses from here with his sons. Directly across King Street on York is the old red brick building with the construction date 1899 facing King Street. Now it houses various shops and businesses, but it used to be the John Clark and Son Carriage Company. This business sold carriages and farm machinery. The prominent Nova Scotian architect, James Charles Philip Dumarec, drew the original plans, but after construction delays, the local architect William Menu altered Dumarec's plans, and the construction was finished accordingly. Note the window designs and the brickwork patterns. In 1915, the Clarks brought the first Chevrolet automobile to Fredericton and established the dealership. And today, it is on Prospect Street and is the oldest Chevrolet dealer in Canada. Further south along York Street, next to a car park area, sits an early 20th century brick house. It's on the northeast corner of Brunswick and York. Similar brick houses were built downtown, but were demolished before the 1970s in the name of urban progress. Dr. George Close Van Wart ran his medical practice here until 1938. His son, Dr. Arthur Van Wart, joined the practice and lived in this very brick house at 391 Brunswick Street. Before the brick house was built, a very attractive large wooden house and gardens stood near this corner. Across Brunswick Street on York is the Brunswick Street Baptist Church. It replaced a wooden church built in 1840, and that one burned down in 1882. This present Gothic-style church was designed by D.E. Dunham, an architect in St. John, New Brunswick. It was built with purple-grey sandstone from a quarry near Fredericton. Finished in 1883, its interior has the typical Baptist semicircular pews facing the pulpit and a large balcony. There is much beautiful woodwork inside. Right next door is the large 3-story red brick building. It was earlier known as the York Street School. It was designed by the prominent Nova Scotian architect James Charles Philip Dumarec, who lived from 1844 to 1906. By the way, his other major building designs downtown are the Legislature, the Randolph Building, the old Charlotte Street School, now the Charlotte Street Arts Centre, and St. Paul's United Church. What you see now on York Street was built in 1893 on the site of the 1835-built Baptist Seminary building. From 1893 until 1923, it operated as the Fredericton High School, but when a new high school was built on George Street in 1924, this building became an elementary school. Then, in 1965, the Baptist Church bought it and renamed it York House. 42 years later, in 2007, the city of Fredericton acquired the building from the church as part of a complex settlement to save York House from demolition. Ted Jones wrote a great flashback article on the school, and that is now available from the Heritage Trust website. Along York Street and south past George Street are a number of 2.5-story houses. They have steeply pitched roofs, designed for managing heavy winter snowfalls. In the early years, residents were required by law to build their houses quite close to the front property lines. So that's why the front doors of so many houses open only a few steps from the sidewalk. The house at 245 York Street is a large, elegant one. John and Martha Harvey built it in 1894. John Harvey had established himself as one of the leading New Brunswick photographers. His business, Harvey Studios, is still standing opposite City Hall. When John died young in 1901, Martha took over the studio. Now here was a woman ahead of her time. She turned her husband's studio into a very successful and wealthy venture. After 16 years of hard work, in 1917, she sold to photographer Frank Pridham, on the condition that the Harvey name remain. Martha continued her philanthropic work, and in 1932 she founded the York Sunbury Historical Society, which, in 1934, founded the museum, now called the Fredericton Region Museum. The Martha J. Harvey Award of Distinction for Excellence in History Studies is given annually by the Society. Martha died in 1934. Moving south, just across Saunders Street, are houses that sit on the site of Fredericton's first indoor skating rink. The rink's gigantic round structure was built on the same plan as the Victoria Rink in St. John. Fredericton citizens called it the Circular Rink. It opened with great fanfare on December 17, 1868. Crowds of skaters and spectators filled the rink. In the balcony, the 22nd Cheshire Regiment Military Band played the skating music. However, after this regiment left town in May 1869, the rink began to struggle financially. By 1880, the roof was leaking so badly that skating had to stop. An American company leased the building to store 45 tons of hay. But on April 9, 1881, just 13 years after that grand opening, a huge fire destroyed the whole rink. The next street, crossing York Street, is Aberdeen. It formed the northern boundary of an important working-class community called Rabbit Town. In the late 1890s, an industrial enclave was developing at the back of town, then around Aberdeen Street. When the first train station was built in 1869, citizens questioned its location because it was far beyond city limits. Would passengers be safe as they walked north from the station into town? How long would it take to get home? However, as Fredericton grew, the location of the train station no longer felt remote. In fact, with all the industries growing around it at the dawn of the 20th century, the train station was ideally situated to serve the commercial and shipping interests. 3 footwear factories, tanneries, and the Chestnut Canoe Factory, for example, were growing their businesses quickly. They used the trains to move their goods out to national and international markets. New, mass-produced, and well-priced footwear for North Americans and others further afield was in high demand. So the section of York Street from Aberdeen up to what is now Dundonald Street was just humming with factories, businesses, and people. All this activity sponsored a housing boom in the area. However, most of the residents did not actually work at the factories. They built their own communities that extended past the train station at Aberdeen, going south and up the hill as far as Montgomery Street. Rabbit Town's eastern boundary became Regent Street, and its western boundary became Smythe Street. But no one is sure how this relatively large area of town became known as Rabbit Town. The Argyle and York Street intersection signals one of the major factories. The Hart Boot and Shoe Company at 401 York Street was designed by the prominent city architect William Menew. The actual shoe factory was founded by Odber Hart. It opened in 1899, and by 1900, 300 employees made 1,000 pairs of shoes daily. 3 years later, in 1903, production had doubled. 500 employees now made 2,000 pairs each day. In 1904, Odber left, somewhat abruptly, to return to the United States, and his business continued under various managements over the years. The factory's doors closed in 1999. Working conditions had deteriorated, and labor unrest and union strikes had grown. An unpleasant 19th century Dickensian-type atmosphere had developed in the building. Today, this great structure is a privately owned apartment complex. Visible from York Street but just along Argyle Street is number 364 Argyle. Now that was another shoemaker, the former Palmer McClellan Shoe Factory, with its many symmetrical windows on 3 stories. Continuing south, the 5 houses on York Street between Victoria and Dundonald Streets are worth a mention. They show us examples of the kind of housing that was needed in the very early 20th century as the town expanded. Houses numbered 451, 455, 467, and 479 to 481 were built between 1900 and 1910. Number 475 to 477 was built just after the Second World War in 1947. Eastwards, across the intersection of York and Dundonald Streets, is one of the city's 2 fire stations. But from 1823, we would have seen the Fredericton Almshouse. It was a large structure built with stone on the property itself. The fire escape for the upper floors was a giant metal tube clinging to a side wall. After its doors opened in 1823, the place was soon filled with the poor, the aged, the sick, and the mentally ill. Children were sent there too, as well as adults. By 1950, it was called the Municipal Home and then the Hillcrest Home, before it was demolished in 1970 for the construction of the fire station. Under the street pavement, we are told, lie the remains of some of the poor people who had to live in that house. Now we look at the eastern side of York Street towards the river. Just past the northeast corner of York and Dundonald is the red brick building of what was the Chestnut Canoe Factory. On the side of the building, see the numbers 470, 472 and 474 York Street posted on a sign. Chestnut canoe operations were developing rapidly from their small beginning in 1897. The company was officially founded in 1905 and managed by Robert Chestnut. It stayed within the family when Robert's son Henry and grandsons Harry and William moved the growing business in 1908 from Upper Queen Street to Upper York Street. The Chestnut Canoe Factory became the largest industry of its kind in the British Empire. By 1914, this world-famous company was turning out 1,200 beautiful canoes every year. They also supplied the armed forces with thousands of pairs of snowshoes. Today, old chestnut canoes are highly prized. This factory building is actually the second factory on this site. The first factory was designed by local architect William Menew, built by Moses Mitchell and finished in 1908. But 13 years later, in December 1921, it all burned down in a spectacular blaze. So William Menew was again hired to design a new factory in 1922. In 1923, the building was finished, but after 55 years of operation, the business closed its doors in 1978. Next door, at 414 to 422 York Street, is the long warehouse for the Chestnut Canoe Factory. Moses Mitchell built it in 1910 for storing canoes and canoe forms before they were shipped out from the railway station next door. Further north, towards the river, is an old brick building with a new liquor store at the back. The old building was the second train station on the site. The earlier wooden one, built in 1869, was no longer needed when this brick building was ready for use in December of 1923. So the 54-year-old wooden station was hauled across the streets to the northeast corner of Victoria and Northumberland Streets. Today, this piece of transport history is an apartment building. Fredericton's new 1923 Union Station building had outside walls of red tapestry brick. The ornamental base border used sandstone from Nova Scotia. The west end, at York Street, shows the original, small, decorative red tile cross in the lower gable, and an arched window in the upper gable. In the early 1920s, both the Canadian Pacific Railway, the CPR, and the Canadian National Railway, CNR, operated daily freight and passenger trains into the York Street station, hence the informal use of the name Union Station. It was the golden age of railway. The railway yards were large, and they had to be. Station operations needed repair shops, engine houses, freight storage, loading platforms, engine turning lines, a coal shed, a water tower, and tracks for moving cargo and passenger trains 7 days a week. Union Station welcomed everyone: ordinary travellers, special trains and coaches, celebrities, and government and royal VIPs. But by the 1950s, automobiles were rapidly replacing the trains. On September the 14th, 1985, passenger train services stopped. All other station services stopped on May the 31st, 1986. By the end of the 20th century, some railway tracks had become walking trails. The little station was abandoned. The land became bare. In 1992, the federal government declared it to be a National Heritage Railway Site, but it deteriorated for many years before its private ownership restoration in 2011. Now, that 1923 building serves liquor sales and tasting operations. Close by Union Station, and at the back of the office building at Aberdeen and York, is an old red brick building. It has, on the liquor shop side, 8 first-story window openings. It was built in 1912 beside the train station to house the leather tanning operations of the Palmer McClellan Shoepack Company. All of the 3 shoe factories in the city stood near the railway yards for easy shipping of their goods to North American and other mass markets. East of York Street, close by on Charlotte Street, is a large white building at number 433 Charlotte. It has 4 large columns and the word Kirk on the front. It used to be a large wooden church built in 1829 and was known as the Old Kirk on George Street. It could hold 600 worshippers. Incredibly, that building was moved not once, but twice. In 1882, it had to be hauled from George Street around the corner to face York Street. There, it was a place of worship while the then St. Paul's Presbyterian Church was being built. Then, in 1916, Fraser Memorial Hall was added to St. Paul's, so the kirk was hauled away again, this time southwards to the next intersection and around another corner to face Charlotte Street. Today, it functions as Kirk Apartments. At the southeast corner of George and York Streets is the registered National Historic Site of St. Paul's United Church. It was earlier known as St. Paul's Presbyterian Church. The prominent Nova Scotian architect, James Charles Philip Dumarec, designed the church in High Victorian Gothic Revival style. It was dedicated in 1886. Citizens today still appreciate its large rose window and other striking interior features. About 60 metres north, across George Street, is 180 York Street. Here is how the authors of the 2006 book Building Capital describe this elegant building. Quote, "It is a fine residential example of the Gothic Revival style, which was introduced to Fredericton architecture after the building of Christchurch Cathedral in the 1840s to 50s. This residence probably dates from the 1860s and boasts a pair of steep gabled dormers with opulent Gothic bargeboard trim, capped with pendants and finials, and a generous wraparound veranda, albeit classical in style and likely a later addition." End of quote from John LaRue and Peter Pacey in Building Capital, page 7. 176 York Street is, quote, "an outstanding example of the Second Empire style in an unusual two-bay side entrance rendition. The telltale mansard roof is accompanied by an elegant pair of full-height tower bays capped with small pointed dormer windows fronting the street." End of quote from Building Capital, 2006 edition by John LaRue and Peter Pacey, page 7. 160 York Street at the corner of Brunswick was designed in the Beaux-Arts style with its, quote, "classical frontispiece with its huge colonnaded portico and solid veranda with balustrade." End quote from Building Capital, 2006 by John LaRue and Peter Pacey, page 7. The original house on this site looked quite different. It was larger, with gardens, but its style was the same as that of today's 180 York Street building, that is, Gothic Revival. It was the home of prominent lawyer G. Frederick Fisher. Walk north past the King's Place Mall until you reach King Street. There is an interesting heritage building, or what remains of it, at the northeast corner of York and King Streets. It is part of the 1877 Edgecombe's Block building at 98 York Street. The original date is still visible facing York Street. Earlier Edgecombe buildings on this site were destroyed by fire in 1861 and 1871, but the business of making carriages, sleighs, wagons, and hearses just kept going. These horse-drawn conveyances were displayed along York and King Streets. In 1963, fire destroyed the third and fourth floors of the original and very handsome building. The final block of York Street, before Queen Street, has many small businesses today, with offices and apartments above, much as it did in the 1800s. Then, a temperance hall with a distinctive mansard roof and windows with round tops, operated in the middle of the block, at what is now a shop at 74 York Street. Retail shops were on the ground floor, and above, the temperance members worked to help people resist drinking alcohol. That's the end of our Lower York Street tour. You may find more information, plus lots of great old and new photographs from our website, www.heritagefredericton.org. Once at our website, please send us your comments and suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. Goodbye.